I stood at the airport gate, clutching my boarding pass with shaking hands, a smile still lingering on my face. Then the scanner flashed red, invalid. My son pulled me aside, his voice sharp, his eyes cold. You don't have a ticket. Go home. Go home? After saving for 20 years, after paying $20,000, after dreaming of one sunset in Hawaii with the family I built, I was being left behind. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Edward Callahan sat at the oak dining table, his fingers tracing the edges of an old leather scrapbook. Its pages were worn, yellowed at the corners, but every photo inside carried the weight of a promise. There she was, his late wife, Margaret, smiling against the backdrop of a cheap state fair sunset, her handwriting scrawled neatly beside the picture. One day, Ed, we'll see a real one in Hawaii. He had kept that scrapbook for decades, more like a vow than a keepsake. Tonight, at 70, he whispered into the silence of the house, Maggie, it's time. He walked to the small study, opened the lockbox that had guarded his modest savings, and carefully withdrew a thick envelope of cash, $20,000. Every bill represented years of careful planning, skipped luxuries, and the discipline of a retired high school teacher who lived frugally so his family could someday taste something bigger than their quiet Midwestern suburb. His hands trembled, not from doubt, but from the magnitude of the moment. This was not just money. It was Margaret's dream being brought to life. The next evening, he invited his son, Brian, and Brian's wife, Lily, over for dinner. He laid the scrapbook on the table, right beside the steaming pot roast Anna had prepared. Ed's voice carried a rare brightness as he flipped the pages, showing them photographs of his youth, of Margaret's laughter frozen in time. She always wanted this trip, Ed explained, his eyes moist. Hawaii, the sunsets, the sand. She never got to see it. But now I want us all to go. As a family. Brian leaned back in his chair, smirking as if the idea were already his. That's incredible, Dad, really. Let me handle everything. The flights, the hotel, the bookings. You don't need the stress. His words were smooth, rehearsed, dripping with confidence. Lily, tapping her manicured nails on her wine glass, offered only a polite smile, though her eyes rolled ever so slightly at Ed's sentimental tone. Still, Ed's chest swelled with pride. For years, he had felt like a relic in their lives, useful only for birthdays and holidays. But now he was the provider again, the patriarch. Trusting Brian with the responsibility felt like passing down, not just money, but purpose. Thank you, son, Ed said quietly, pressing the envelope into Brian's hands. This means everything. From the corner of the room, Anna, Ed's younger sister, watched the exchange with a tightening jaw. She had known Brian all his life and recognized the flicker of calculation in his eyes. Ed, she said softly, once Lily stepped into the kitchen, don't put everything in his hands. At least keep some control. It's a lot of money. Ed waved her concern away, smiling at the son he still believed could do no wrong. He's my boy, Anna. I trust him. The words were final, a father's blind faith spoken as if they were unbreakable truth. That night, after the dishes were cleared and the family had left, Ed sat alone in his living room. The scrapbook rested open on his lap, the photo of Margaret staring back at him. He imagined the Pacific waves, the smell of salt air, the warmth of his grandchildren's laughter under the Hawaiian sun. For the first time in years, he felt young again, alive with purpose. But as he closed the scrapbook and turned off the lamp, a small unease lingered in the pit of his stomach, one he couldn't quite name. He ignored it, brushing it aside the way one brushes off a passing shadow. After all, what could possibly go wrong? A week after handing Brian the money, Ed pulled into his son's driveway with a trunk full of surprises. The sun was still high, children's bikes scattered across the lawn, and laughter echoed faintly from inside the house. Ed's heart beat faster as he lifted the cardboard box from his car, the scent of fabric softener rising from freshly washed shirts inside. He rang the bell, and when Brian's two young kids opened the door, he held the box like a magician, ready for a grand reveal. "Close your eyes," he told them, his voice brimming with excitement. The kids giggled, covering their faces with tiny hands. Ed placed around their necks two bright Hawaiian leis, plastic orchids in bold purples and reds, and slipped shirts into their arms. When they opened their eyes, their squeals filled the house. The boys darted to the mirror, laughing at their new tropical look, spinning in circles as if Hawaii had already arrived in their living room. Ed's eyes misted over. For a moment, he felt the weight of his years lift. He was no longer just the old man neighbors pitied for eating alone. He was a grandfather who gave joy, a patriarch who could still shape memories. His chest swelled with pride as the children shouted, "Thanks, Grandpa! We're going to Hawaii!" Brian entered from the kitchen, his phone still in hand, earbuds dangling. He grinned at the sight of his kids, but quickly shifted the attention back to himself. "Pretty great, huh? We're taking them first class, Dad. I told some of my colleagues about it. Everyone's jealous I'm finally giving my family a real vacation." He chuckled, tapping his son's shoulder. "Told them I've been working hard, saving for something big. They're impressed." Ed froze for a beat. He wasn't sure he heard right. "I've been saving." The words landed heavily, like a stone dropped in still water. But Brian's tone was casual, almost rehearsed, and soon he was back to scrolling his phone. From behind him, Lily appeared. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching Ed fuss over the children. Her lips curled into a small, dismissive smirk. "You really went all out with the costumes," she said dryly, her tone sharp enough to puncture Ed's joy. "They'll outgrow those before the trip's over." Ed swallowed, forcing a smile. He didn't want to argue, not with the kids still bouncing around, waving their arms like hula dancers. He brushed off her comment, but the sting lingered. Across the room, Anna caught it too. She had come over for coffee and now sat quietly in the armchair, observing. She noticed how Brian shifted credit in his story, how Lily's eyes rolled when Ed beamed with excitement. But she stayed silent, folding her hands tightly in her lap. She had warned her brother once, and he had waved her off. To speak again now would only plant tension where the children's laughter had brought light. Later that evening, back at his own house, Ed pulled the scrapbook from the coffee table once more. He studied the faded picture of Margaret in her sundress, her hair blowing in a Midwestern breeze, her handwritten wish etched beside it. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine it. The crash of waves, warm sand between his toes, the orange glow of the Hawaiian sun melting into the horizon as Margaret's hand rested in his. He could almost hear her laughter again. A slow smile stretched across his face. He believed it was all falling into place, exactly as it was meant to. The family would finally share her dream. He would finally keep his promise. The tickets, the itinerary, the hotel. Brian controlled it all. And Ed, with his heart full of trust and longing, never once thought that might be dangerous. The morning of departure arrived like Christmas had come late in Ed Callahan's life. He rose before dawn, the nervous energy of a schoolboy coursing through him. His suitcase had been packed since the night before, neatly folded Hawaiian shirts and a wide-brimmed hat tucked on top. He even polished his old leather shoes, though they'd be traded for sandals soon enough. By the time Anna pulled up to drive him, Ed was already waiting at the curb, ticket and passport clutched in his hand, as if they were golden keys to another life. At the airport, he moved with careful precision, double-checking every sign, every screen. Families bustled around him with strollers and luggage, but Ed felt strangely proud. He was part of them, part of the stream of travelers headed somewhere beautiful. He sat near the gate, his eyes wandering over the giant mural of palm trees and surfboards decorating the terminal wall. For the first time in decades, his heart felt light. When Brian and Lily finally appeared, they swept in like they were late to their own wedding. Designer bags slung over Lily's shoulders, Brian barking into his phone. The two of them radiated irritation. "Dad, why'd you come so early?" Brian muttered, barely looking at him. "Boarding's not for another hour." Ed smiled, unfazed. "Didn't want to risk missing it. Your mother would have killed me if I ever showed up late for a trip." His attempt at humor earned only a dismissive shake of the head from Brian and a sigh from Lily as she adjusted her sunglasses, despite being indoors. As the line began forming for the security check, Ed's excitement bubbled over. He opened his passport, rehearsing in his head what it would feel like to step onto the jetway, to finally cross an ocean. But when the agent scanned his documents, her brow furrowed. She scanned again, then again. "Sir," she said slowly, "something isn't matching here." A chill ran down Ed's spine. "What do you mean?" He handed her the ticket Brian had given him, his fingers trembling now. The scanner beeped sharply, red letters flashing across the small screen. "Not valid." For a second, the world went quiet. Ed stared at the words, uncomprehending. "There must be some mistake," he stammered. "My son booked this. We're traveling together." Brian stepped forward, a practiced calm in his voice, though his jaw was tight. "Dad, can we talk for a second?" He pulled Ed aside, lowering his tone, but not his cruelty. "Listen, you're not coming." The words hit like a punch to the chest. Ed blinked, his mouth dry, trying to process. "What do you mean I'm not coming? I gave you the money, $20,000. His voice cracked, the desperation audible. Brian avoided his eyes. "It didn't work out. There were only enough seats for 4. We'll make it up to you another time." Behind them, passengers shuffled, curious eyes beginning to linger. Lily stood off to the side, her lips curling into something between impatience and smugness, as if the scene were a minor inconvenience. Ed's face burned. "You can't be serious," he whispered, his throat closing in. This was Margaret's dream. Our dream. He turned, desperate for someone, anyone, to fix this mistake. But the ticket agent had already moved on, and the gate doors were opening. "Dad," Brian said firmly, his hand pressing into his father's shoulder, "don't make this harder. Go home." The words echoed in Ed's ears, louder than the announcements blaring over the intercom. He felt strangers' eyes on him, judging, pitying, while his son, the boy he had raised, trusted, and believed in, stood before him as executioner. Ed's knees threatened to give out, his chest hollow. Around him, the line kept moving, families boarding, laughter trailing down the jetway. And he remained frozen, his dream crumbling into dust. The gate door closed with a heavy click, and Ed was left staring, unable to breathe, unable to move, caught in the wreckage of a betrayal too sharp to name. Brian's words came like a blade, sharp and final. "We only had money for 4, Dad. You don't have a seat." Ed's head jerked back, as if he'd been slapped. "What are you talking about? I gave you $20,000. His voice cracked, breaking under the strain of disbelief. His hands shook, clutching the useless ticket, as though squeezing it tighter might force it into existence. Lily stepped closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She adjusted her sunglasses with casual disdain, eyes sweeping over Ed as though he were a stranger blocking her path. "That barely covered us," she said, lips curling in a smirk. "You know how expensive first class is. You should be grateful we managed it all." Grateful. The words slammed into him, absurd and cruel. Ed felt the heat rise in his chest, but before he could respond, 2 security staff approached. One of them, a tall man with a clipboard, cleared his throat. "Sir, is there a problem here?" Brian straightened immediately, slipping into the smooth confidence he used at work. "No problem," he said quickly, gesturing toward Ed. "He's not traveling with us. There's been a misunderstanding." Ed's eyes widened. No, that's not true. I paid for this trip. It's my money. This was supposed to be my family's vacation. His voice rose, breaking through the din of the terminal. Passengers turned their heads, whispers rippling through the crowd. The sight of the old man pleading while his son stood cold beside him made strangers pause, phones even lifting discreetly to record. The guard looked between father and son, uncertain. "Sir, if your ticket isn't valid, because he made it that way." Ed's voice shook with rage and humiliation. He turned to Brian, desperate, searching for a shred of mercy in his son's face. "Brian, please, you can't do this to me. I saved for years. This was your mother's dream, our dream. Don't shut me out like this." But Brian's expression didn't waver. He didn't flinch, didn't soften. He leaned close, lowering his voice so only Ed could hear, though the venom still dripped from every word. "You're old. You'll slow us down. We'll have more fun without you. Go home, Dad." The finality of it shattered Ed. His legs weakened, the ticket crumpling in his trembling fist. Around him, the crowd's whispers grew louder, their stares heavy with pity. Some shook their heads in quiet disgust at Brian, others simply watched in silence, but no one stepped forward. Ed tried one last time, his voice breaking, barely a whisper. "Please, son, don't leave me behind like this." His knees buckled, and he sank against the cold wall of the gate, his body hunched, shoulders shaking. For 70 years, he had been a man of dignity, a husband, a teacher, a father, and in a single moment, his own flesh and blood had stripped it all away in front of strangers. Brian didn't even look back. He pressed his hand to Lily's back, guiding her and the children forward. Lily glanced over her shoulder, the smirk still faintly tugging at her lips, as if the sight of the old man crumbling behind her was little more than an inconvenience. The gate attendants scanned their tickets, the machine beeping green each time, and the family disappeared down the jetway. Ed remained behind, slumped on the terminal floor, his face hidden in his hands. The sound of the gate door locking into place was louder than the boarding announcements, louder than the rolling suitcases around him. It was the sound of exile. The security staff exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't intervene further. There was nothing to resolve, no valid ticket, no seat, no place for him. Slowly, they stepped back, leaving Ed alone in the echo of his humiliation. The crowd thinned as passengers boarded, their murmurs fading into distance. Ed was left standing in the empty terminal, his body trembling, his soul hollowed out. And as the last announcement called for the doors to close, he lifted his eyes toward the windows, watching the plane taxi onto the runway. Inside were his son, his grandchildren, his family, all carried toward the dream he had paid for. He remained behind, a shadow pressed against the glass, while the plane lifted into the sky without him. The roar of the departing jet engines echoed through the glass walls of the terminal, fading into the distance like the sound of a door slamming shut forever. Ed sat slumped in a stiff plastic chair, his suitcase at his feet, the useless ticket crushed in his trembling hand. Around him, the once crowded gate now stood silent, rows of empty seats bearing witness to his humiliation. The family he had saved for, dreamed for, lived for, was gone, ascending into the sky without him. His eyes fixed on the tarmac, where the plane grew smaller against the gray horizon. In the reflection of the wide terminal window, he caught a glimpse of himself, shoulders bent, face hollow, eyes glistening with tears. Margaret's voice returned to him like a ghost, soft but unrelenting. "You promised we'd see Hawaii together, Ed." The memory of her laughter stung sharper than the jet's retreat. He pressed his palm against the glass, as if by sheer will he could call the plane back, undo the betrayal, rewind time. His phone buzzed faintly in his pocket. With desperate hands, he dialed Brian's number. Each ring dragged on like a blade across his chest. Voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. He sent a message. "Please call me. Please don't do this." But the screen stayed blank, No reply, no acknowledgement. The silence from his son was louder than the roar of the engines. Minutes bled into an hour before Anna's car pulled up outside the terminal. When she found him sitting alone near the baggage carousel, her face crumpled in horror. "Ed," she whispered, rushing to him, her hands gripping his shoulders. "What happened?" The words caught in his throat, too heavy to speak. He managed only fragments. "Ticket, not valid, told me to go home." His voice broke with each phrase, his chest heaving under the weight of shame. Anna helped him to his feet, her arm around him like a lifeline. As they walked through the sliding glass doors into the night air, Ed finally let go. In the back seat of her car, the dam inside him burst. He sobbed into his hands, his whole body shaking with grief so raw it frightened her. She kept her eyes on the road, blinking back her own tears, whispering over and over, "I'm so sorry, Ed. I'm so sorry." The ride home was quiet, but for the sound of his quiet gasps, the kind a man makes when his pride has been stripped bare in front of strangers. By the time they reached his house, he looked hollowed out, as though years had been carved from him in the span of an afternoon. That night, alone in his living room, Ed turned on his phone again. A new notification lit the screen, a photo posted on Lily's social media. There they were, Brian, Lily, and the children, standing on a sunlit Hawaiian beach, all wearing bright leis, their arms raised in triumph. Brian's caption read, "Finally here! Family trip of a lifetime! We made it!" Ed stared at the smiling faces, his grandchildren holding surfboards, Lily clutching a cocktail, Brian flashing his confident grin. His throat closed, bile rising, tears burning his eyes. They looked like the perfect family. His family. Except he wasn't in the frame. He wasn't anywhere. The betrayal cut deeper than words, slicing into his chest until it was hard to breathe. He turned the phone face down on the table, unable to look anymore. Unable to erase the image seared into his mind. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, the house groaning under its emptiness. Ed sat motionless, his body heavy, his heart hollow. And as the glow from the phone screen dimmed across the room, he realized he had been left behind in more ways than one. The days after the airport humiliation passed in a haze. Ed barely left the house, curtains drawn against the summer sun. He couldn't face the neighbors. The thought of running into them, of hearing their polite but knowing voices asking, "So, how was Hawaii?" was unbearable. Instead, he lived in silence, the walls of his home closing in, the scrapbook on the coffee table untouched. Even the sound of children playing in nearby yards stung like salt in a wound. Anna, however, refused to let the matter rest. Furious and protective, she stormed to Brian's house days after the flight. She confronted him in the driveway as he unloaded groceries from the back of his SUV, his tan already setting into his skin. "How could you do this to your father?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Brian shrugged, cool as ever. "He offered the money. It was a gift, Anna. He's just confused." "A gift?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. "He sat in an empty airport while you took your kids on his dream trip. That wasn't confusion. That was cruelty." But Brian had already turned away, dismissing her words like buzzing flies. Lily, stepping out with shopping bags, tossed a smirk over her shoulder. "He'll be fine. He's old. He'll get over it." Back home, Anna repeated the exchange to Ed, her voice thick with rage and sorrow. Ed only nodded, eyes downcast, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He couldn't bear to admit it aloud. His son wasn't just careless. He had been deliberate. The proof arrived each time Ed picked up his phone. Lily's social media brimmed with glossy photos. Brian behind the controls of a helicopter, the children laughing at a luau, cocktails balanced on a balcony overlooking the Pacific. Each image was a knife, carving deeper into Ed's chest. They weren't just in Hawaii. They were thriving, celebrating, flaunting the dream he had paid for as though he had never existed. Late one night, unable to sleep, Ed sat at his desk with the glow of his computer screen casting harsh light on his weary face. He logged into his bank account, scrolling through the statements with shaking hands. The $20,000 withdrawal was there in black and white, gone without a trace. No refunds, no credits, no indication he had ever been included in the plan. The numbers were final, merciless. His savings, his wife's dream, erased. He opened a drawer, pulled out a pen and yellow-lined paper, and began to write. His hand trembled as the words spilled out. "Brian, I don't know who you are anymore. I gave you my trust, my savings, my heart, and in return, you left me to rot. I would have given you anything, son, but not this. Not the chance to spit on your mother's memory. I can't forgive what you did to me." By the time he finished, the paper was smudged with tears. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and set it on the desk. But when morning came, he couldn't bring himself to send it. Instead, it remained tucked in a drawer, an unsent confession of pain, too heavy to bear. When the isolation grew unbearable, Ed finally forced himself to keep his doctor's appointment. Dr. Green studied him carefully, noting the weight loss, the drawn face, the restless hands. After the examination, the doctor sat down, speaking gently but firmly. "Ed, your blood pressure is climbing. The stress is eating at you. You're not a young man anymore. You can't carry this anger without consequence." Ed's lips pressed into a thin line. He nodded, but inside, the storm only raged louder. "He stole more than money," he whispered, almost to himself. "He stole dignity. He stole my place in my own family." Dr. Green's eyes softened. "Then you need to decide whether you'll let that theft define the rest of your life." But Ed didn't answer. He stared past the doctor, his jaw clenched, the silence heavy with an unspoken vow. Sunday morning came heavy with dread. Ed had always gone to church. It was tradition, habit, and ritual all in one. But this week, he felt the walls of the small town pressing in on him. Still, he put on his jacket, combed his thinning hair, and walked into the sanctuary. The stained glass windows cast soft colors across the pews. But the moment he stepped inside, he could feel the whispers ripple like wind through tall grass. Two women near the vestibule leaned close to one another. "Didn't Ed pay for that trip?" one whispered, not as quietly as she thought. "Why wasn't he there?" The other frowned, shrugging, as if the answer itself was scandal. Ed forced a smile when people greeted him, nodding politely, his throat dry. He sat in his usual spot near the front, hands folded tightly in his lap. But every hushed murmur carried to him, every sideways glance scraped at the wound still raw inside. The words weren't accusations, but they carried pity, pity sharper than any insult. After the service, as families gathered outside under the morning sun, the humiliation deepened. Brian arrived late, strolling across the churchyard with Lily at his side and their children bounding ahead. His skin was bronzed, his shirt freshly pressed, his laughter loud. He slapped men on the back, shaking hands, retelling stories of luau's, helicopter rides, and ocean sunsets. Each detail was crafted to impress, his voice carrying so the whole crowd could hear. Ed stood at a distance, the image burning. Brian looked like the man of the hour, the son everyone admired, and Ed, the father who had made it all possible, stood alone, invisible, erased. Then Lily delivered the final blow. Someone asked if the trip had been difficult without Ed, and she let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, we managed just fine without the old man," she said, her eyes flicking toward him with cruel amusement. The group chuckled politely, but the damage was done. Ed's body stiffened. For a moment, his vision blurred red, his fists clenching at his sides. He wanted to shout, to tell everyone the truth, to expose Brian's theft and cruelty. The words clawed at his throat. "I paid for it. It was mine." but they stayed locked inside. Years of pride, years of dignity held him back. To explode in public would only make him smaller. Instead, he turned away, walking slowly down the church steps, the murmurs trailing behind him. Each step felt heavier than the last, his chest burning, his jaw aching from holding in the fury. He reached his car, gripping the doorframe so tightly his knuckles whitened. Inside, with the windows rolled up, the dam nearly broke. His breath came ragged, his eyes stinging. He slammed the steering wheel once. The sound muffled inside the cabin. For 70 years, he had built his reputation on patience, on decency, on trust. And now his own son had not only stolen from him, but had turned his name into a public joke. As he started the engine, the rage that had simmered beneath grief began to shift. It no longer felt like sorrow. It felt like fire. The humiliation had hardened into something darker, heavier, something that demanded more than forgiveness or silence. Ed drove home in silence, his face expressionless, but his heart no longer only broken. It was sharpening. Ed stood on Brian's front porch, the autumn wind tugging at his jacket. His knuckles hovered over the door for a long moment before he finally knocked. He had rehearsed his words all morning, but as the door opened and Brian appeared, casually dressed, phone in hand, all that preparation crumbled into raw emotion. "Brian," Ed began, his voice already thick, "we need to talk." Brian sighed as though his father's presence was an inconvenience. "Dad, this isn't a good time. I've got calls lined up." Ed pushed past the excuse. "I gave you that money for all of us, for the family, for your mother's dream, and you left me at the airport like a stranger." Brian's expression hardened, a flicker of annoyance passing through his eyes. "Dad, you're remembering it wrong. You offered the money. You said you wanted us to enjoy ourselves. It was a gift." "A gift?" Ed's voice cracked, echoing in the entryway. "No, Brian, it wasn't a gift. It was a promise. It was for all of us, not just you. I trusted you." His hands shook, his eyes burning as he searched for even a shadow of remorse in his son's face. Instead, Lily's voice floated in from the living room. She emerged with a glass of wine in her hand, her tone dripping with disdain. "This is pathetic. You're old, Ed. You can't keep clinging to everything. It's over. Move on." Her words pierced deeper than she knew. They weren't just cruel, they were dismissive, stripping away the very worth he had left. Ed turned back to Brian, desperate. "You let her talk to me like this. I'm your father." Brian's jaw tightened. "Enough, Dad. This conversation is over." Before Ed could respond, the door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through his chest like a gunshot. He stood on the porch, staring at the wood grain inches from his face, his body rigid with disbelief. The world outside was quiet, the hum of distant traffic, a cruel contrast to the storm inside him. He lingered for a moment, his breath shallow, before finally turning away. Each step down the porch felt heavier than the last, his cane tapping against the concrete with the rhythm of defeat. By the time he reached the sidewalk, his shoulders sagged, his chest hollow. Anna was waiting in her car, watching with anxious eyes. She had insisted on coming, sensing how fragile he was after weeks of silence. When Ed slid into the passenger seat, she took one look at his face and knew. "What did he say?" she asked softly. Ed's voice was little more than a whisper. "He said it was a gift, that I offered it." His hands clenched in his lap, knuckles white. Anna's eyes filled with fire. "That's not true, Ed. He's rewriting the story. If you don't fight back, he'll erase you completely. Do you understand? He'll make everyone believe it never happened, that you were never part of it." Ed turned to her slowly, her words echoing in his mind. For weeks, he had lived in shame, in grief, convinced his life was shrinking into irrelevance. But now, as her warning sank in, something shifted. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It wasn't just loss. deep in the hollow place where grief had lived, something else began to take root. He looked back toward Brian's house, the blinds closed, the laughter of his grandchildren muffled behind walls that had shut him out. His lips tightened into a thin line. It was the first flicker, not yet a plan, not yet a fire, but a spark, a dangerous, undeniable spark of revenge. The phone rang on a gray Tuesday morning, its shrill tone cutting through the stillness of Ed's kitchen. He answered, expecting Anna, but instead a curt voice asked for Edward Callahan. When he confirmed, the caller launched into businesslike coldness. This is about the outstanding balance on your son Brian Callahan's account. As guarantor, you are responsible. Ed froze, gripping the receiver tighter. Guarantor? There must be a mistake. I never signed anything. But the caller was firm. Your name and information are listed on the file. We'll be following up. The line went dead, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and Ed's pounding heartbeat. He sat there for several minutes, the phone still pressed to his ear. Then, as if on cue, it rang again. Another creditor, another demand. The same story. Brian had debts, and Ed's name was attached. His stomach knotted. This wasn't about a vacation anymore. The betrayal ran deeper, far uglier. The money hadn't only vanished into beaches and cocktails, it had been swallowed by debts his son had hidden. Later, when Anna dropped by, she found him hunched over a stack of papers at the dining table, his hands trembling. He told her everything, his voice a whisper of disbelief. He used me, Anna. He didn't just take the money for Hawaii. He tied me to his mess. Her face hardened. This isn't just betrayal, Ed. This is fraud. You need to see a lawyer. You need to fight back before he drags you down with him. But Ed shook his head, fear flickering behind his eyes. He's still my son. If I take him to court, it'll destroy what's left of this family. Anna slammed her hand on the table, startling him. What family, Ed? The one that left you at an airport. The one that laughs at you behind your back? If you don't stand up now, you'll lose everything. Not just your money, but your name. Ed didn't argue. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in silence, staring at the stack of envelopes and bank statements spread before him. That night, long after Anna had gone, he began quietly organizing everything. He pulled receipts, transaction records, even old emails from Brian. Piece by piece, the picture grew clear. The $20,000 transfer he had made for the trip was scattered across multiple accounts. Airline charges were there, yes, but smaller than expected. The rest had gone to credit cards, loan payments, cash withdrawals. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't a mistake. As he highlighted the amounts, his chest tightened. The truth settled on him with the weight of concrete. Brian had never planned to take him to Hawaii. From the start, he had been cut out, written off. The airport humiliation wasn't a last-minute cruelty. It was the inevitable result of a plan set in motion long before. Ed leaned back in his chair, his hand covering his mouth, eyes wet but burning with something new. He whispered into the empty room, his voice raw and low. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, sharp, and alive, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. The cemetery lay quiet under a sky thick with clouds. Ed walked slowly along the gravel path, his cane tapping against loose stones, the damp air heavy with the promise of rain. He carried no flowers, just the burden of his shame and the words he could no longer hold inside. When he reached Margaret's grave, he lowered himself onto the bench nearby, his knees aching as much as his heart. He traced her name carved into the granite, his thumb running along the familiar grooves. Maggie, he whispered, his voice breaking. I failed you. The confession hung in the air, swallowed by the stillness around him. For a moment, he closed his eyes, and memory carried him backward. He saw himself as a young man in a hospital room, holding a newborn in trembling arms. Margaret lay exhausted but smiling on the bed, her hair damp with sweat. "Promise me you'll always protect him, Ed," she had whispered. "Promise me you'll give him the best life we can." He had nodded then, tears streaming down his face, certain of the vow he was making. Now, decades later, that promise mocked him. He had protected Brian, provided for him, given him not just a life, but the chance to take his family on a dream vacation. And in return, his son had gutted him in public, cast him aside like an old coat. The weight of failure pressed down, suffocating. Ed bent forward, his forehead resting against the cold stone. "I thought I was giving him a gift," he murmured. "I thought I was keeping my promise to you. But he used me, Maggie. He used me and left me to rot. I don't know how to forgive that." As if the heavens shared his grief, thunder rolled in the distance. The first drops of rain spattered the ground, darkening the earth around the grave. Lightning flared across the sky, illuminating Ed's lined face, his jaw clenched tight. He sat upright, his chest heaving with something that was no longer just sorrow. It was darker, sharper. His hand tightened into a fist against his thigh. "I won't die humiliated," he said, his voice louder now, carried away by the storm. "Not like this. Not with his boot on my neck." The rain came harder, drumming against his coat, soaking him through, but he didn't move. He stared at the headstone, as if Margaret herself were listening, as if she might answer. "If he wants war," Ed whispered, his words low and deliberate, "I'll give him war." The storm answered with another crash of thunder, the sky splitting wide with light. In that moment, Ed no longer felt like a man broken by betrayal. He felt like a man sharpening into something dangerous. The grief was still there, but beneath it something else had taken root. Something that would not fade with time. Something that would not forgive. Ed sat at the dining room table, the surface buried under folders, envelopes, and printouts. A banker's lamp cast a pool of yellow light, the rest of the room swallowed in shadow. He had been at it for hours, sifting through old bank statements, credit card records, and receipts he had saved out of habit. His meticulous teacher's nature, once used for lesson plans and grading papers, was now turned toward a different purpose, uncovering what his son had done to him. At first, the numbers blurred together, long strings of deposits and withdrawals, but slowly, patterns emerged. He saw the $20,000 withdrawal from his savings, recorded cleanly. Then the trail fractured, chunks of money scattered across accounts Brian controlled. Airline charges, yes, but smaller than the sum should have allowed. There were cash withdrawals, debt payments, even wire transfers that had nothing to do with a family vacation. Ed leaned back, rubbing his temples, the ache in his chest growing heavier with every discovery. It wasn't just neglect. It wasn't sloppy planning. It was deliberate. His son had siphoned the money away, using it to plug holes in his own life, while stringing his father along with false promises. Anna came by the next morning to find him still hunched at the table, his eyes bloodshot, his hands stained with ink from scribbled notes. "Ed," she said softly, laying a hand on his shoulder, "you can't keep doing this alone. You need to talk to someone who knows what they're doing. A lawyer." He shook his head instinctively, the old reflex of a father still trying to protect his son. "I can't drag Brian into court. He's my blood." Anna's voice sharpened. "Your blood left you humiliated at an airport and stole your life savings. He doesn't see you as family, Ed. He sees you as a resource. And now you've found proof. You can't just bury it." Her words lingered after she left. That afternoon, Ed made a quiet decision. He drove to a small law office on the edge of town, the kind with wood-paneled walls and a brass nameplate that read Henderson and McKay. The attorney who met him, Mr. Henderson, listened carefully as Ed laid out the facts, sliding across the bank statements and receipts he had collected. When Henderson finished reading, he looked up, his brow furrowed. "Mr. Callahan, if what you're showing me is accurate, your son could be liable for fraud. He accepted money under false pretenses, used it for unrelated purposes, and left you with nothing in return." That's not just unethical, it's illegal. The words landed like a gavel inside Ed's chest. Fraud, illegal. It gave form to what he already knew but had been unwilling to say out loud. His son wasn't just selfish, he was a thief. Ed thanked the lawyer and left with a stack of pamphlets and advice he hadn't yet decided whether to follow. But as he drove home, his mind felt sharper than it had in weeks. The fog of grief had begun to lift, replaced by a colder clarity. That night, he returned to the table with renewed purpose. He bought a cheap filing cabinet from the hardware store, labeling folders in neat block letters: bank records, statements, receipts, notes. He began compiling everything, building a timeline of Brian's deception. Each piece of paper was another brick in a wall he was constructing, not to protect himself, but to corner his son. The quiet rage inside him grew sharper with every page he added. He no longer saw himself as a victim left behind in an airport terminal. He saw himself as a man wronged, gathering ammunition. His pen scratched furiously across yellow pads, his notes a mixture of dates, amounts, and observations. He wrote not just to record, but to harden his resolve. By midnight, he sat back and looked at the folders stacked neatly before him. They weren't just documents, they were weapons. And for the first time since the betrayal, Ed felt something other than grief. It was focus. He turned off the lamp, leaving the house in darkness, but his mind burned with light. The evidence was there. The truth was undeniable. And now, he thought, it was only a matter of when and how he would use it. Ed had always thought of himself as a teacher, not a spy. But as the weeks passed, the quiet rage he had been nurturing transformed into something colder, more deliberate. He no longer spent his evenings drowning in grief. Instead, he found himself parked across the street from Brian's office, a thermos of coffee in hand, his eyes fixed on the glass doors. Brian ran a small financial consulting firm, the kind that promised personalized investment strategies to middle-class families trying to stretch their savings. From the outside, it looked professional: clean signage, sharp suits, shiny cars in the lot. But Ed had learned enough from his bank statements to know better, and now he wanted proof. He began watching patterns: who went in, who came out. He noticed the clients' expressions: tense when they entered, tight-lipped when they left. More than once, he caught fragments of conversation drifting across the parking lot. "He said the fees would be lower," one man muttered to his wife. "I don't understand where the money went." Another slammed his car door, shaking his head. "Feels like a scam." Each word sharpened Ed's resolve. His son wasn't just a bad father, he was a predator, and Ed was no longer willing to let him hunt unchecked. Anna eventually noticed what Ed was doing. One evening, she climbed into his passenger seat uninvited, folding her arms as she stared across at Brian's office. "You can't keep doing this alone," she said. "If he's running a scam, you need someone who can act on it." Ed's voice was low, steady. "Who would believe me? I'm just an old man he cut out of a vacation." Anna shook her head. "Not just an old man, a witness." The next day, she arranged a meeting. Ed found himself sitting in a small, nondescript office downtown, across from a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. Detective Miguel Alvarez introduced himself with a firm handshake. Anna did most of the talking at first, explaining Brian's betrayal, the missing money, and now the suspicious dealings at his firm. Alvarez listened, jotting notes, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Fraud cases," he said carefully, "aren't easy. They take patience. You need evidence, not just suspicion. People like your son." He paused, glancing at Ed. "They build walls of paperwork to protect themselves. If we're going to pursue this, we'll need someone on the inside. Someone who can observe carefully, gather information without being noticed." Ed felt his chest tighten. "You mean me?" Alvarez gave a small nod. "If you're willing, it won't be quick. It won't be clean. But if you want to see justice, you can help us build the case. For the first time in months, Ed felt a surge of energy. It wasn't the bitter rush of rage, nor the hollow ache of grief. It was purpose. Clear, sharp, undeniable. His years as a teacher had taught him patience, attention to detail, the ability to spot inconsistencies others missed. Those same skills, he realized, could now be his weapon. "I'll do it," he said firmly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. From that day forward, Ed's role shifted. He wasn't just a humiliated father anymore. He was an informant. He kept a notebook in his pocket, jotting down details he observed outside Brian's office. Client names, dates, times, fragments of conversation. He researched public complaints late at night, highlighting posts on obscure forums where people mentioned hidden fees, unexplained withdrawals, broken promises. Every piece of information, no matter how small, was fed quietly to Alvarez. And with each new note, each new whisper of evidence, Ed's resolve deepened. The despair that had nearly crushed him was gone, replaced by something sharper than steel. One evening, as he closed his notebook and tucked it into the drawer beside his bed, he caught his reflection in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, he didn't see a broken man staring back. He saw someone waiting, someone plotting. Revenge was no longer just a thought gnawing at the edges of his grief. It had direction, it had discipline, and it was only just beginning. Ed had spent weeks gathering notes, watching, listening, feeding scraps of information to Detective Alvarez. But one night, staring at the neat stack of files in his study, he felt the urge to move beyond patience. The walls of his house were lined with silence, and inside that silence, a thought whispered, "What if I give the world a glimpse? Just a glimpse?" He typed carefully at his computer, his fingers slower than they used to be, but steady with intent. The email was short, anonymous, and unsigned. It contained client names he had overheard, vague details of questionable practices, and one line designed to bait attention. Multiple residents have lodged complaints about Brian Callahan, LLC. Clients report hidden fees and unexplained withdrawals. He attached copies of a few documents, just enough to raise suspicion, not enough to reveal his hand, and clicked send. 2 days later, the story appeared. Buried on page 6 of the local paper, a small column titled, "Concerns Raised About Local Investment Firm." It was only a few paragraphs long, but Ed read every word like scripture. It didn't accuse, it didn't convict, but it planted a seed. Complaints, clients alleging hidden costs, ongoing review. Ed folded the paper neatly, slid it into his drawer, and leaned back in his chair with the faintest smile. For the first time since the airport, he felt control shift, subtle, invisible, but real. Across town, the article landed like a grenade in Brian's office. He stormed through the glass doors, slamming the paper down on his desk. "Who the hell did this?" he barked at his assistant, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Who's spreading lies about me?" The assistant stammered, shaking her head. I don't know, Mr. Callahan. Maybe a competitor." Brian's face flushed red, his hand raking through his hair. "They're jealous. That's all this is. Someone's trying to drag me down." Lily arrived not long after, heels clicking against the tile, sunglasses perched despite the cloudy afternoon. She glanced at the paper, then at her husband's reddened face. "So what? It's a nothing article. Page 6. Nobody reads that far. Ignore it." "Ignore it?" Brian snapped. "Do you know what this does to me if clients see it? My reputation is everything." But Lily only shrugged, her tone laced with annoyance. "Your reputation will survive one gossip piece. Don't make it bigger than it is." Yet Brian's instincts weren't wrong. Within days, clients began asking questions. At first, cautious ones. "I read something in the paper. Is everything okay?" Then sharper, "What about these fees? Why wasn't I told?" Their voices carried unease, their eyes darting toward the door as if calculating escape routes. Each time, Brian smoothed his tie, pasted on a smile, and reassured them with words honed from years of charm. But underneath, anger seethed. His voice grew sharper in private, his movements more restless. He barked at staff. He snapped at Lily. At home, he slammed doors and muttered about rats in the walls. And in his small house across town, Ed read every ripple with quiet satisfaction. He didn't gloat loudly. He didn't need to. The victory was in silence, in watching the first domino tremble. That evening, after Anna dropped off groceries, Ed returned to his study. He opened his leather-bound journal, the one Margaret had once given him for retirement. Its first pages had been filled with gentle reflections, gardening notes, memories of his students, thoughts about his grandchildren. But now, the entries had changed. He dipped his pen, writing in slow, deliberate strokes. The sunset is coming for him. He took Hawaii from me, but I'll bring him something darker. He thinks he can erase me. He doesn't know I'm still here, watching. The ink dried on the page, his words carrying more weight than any conversation he had spoken in months. He closed the journal, slid it back into the drawer, and extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, he sat for a long moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Outside, the world carried on, unaware that a father had declared a private war on his son. And Ed knew, deep in his bones, that this was only the beginning. Ed had rehearsed the moment in his head 100 times, but when he finally pulled into Brian's driveway on a brisk Saturday afternoon, his hand still gripped the steering wheel as though it were the only thing tethering him to earth. The suburban house looked pristine, new siding, manicured lawn, 2 luxury cars in the driveway. It was the image of success, the facade Brian loved to project. But Ed knew better now. He had the proof in his files, the whispers from clients, the article planted in the paper. And today, he wanted his son to look him in the eye. He climbed the front steps, his cane tapping against the concrete, and knocked firmly. After a pause, Brian opened the door, phone in hand, irritation already etched across his face. "Dad," he said flatly, "what do you want?" Ed looked past him into the gleaming foyer, then met his son's eyes. "We need to talk." Brian leaned against the doorframe, smirking. "You still crying over a vacation? God, Dad, it's been months. You're embarrassing yourself." The words hit like knives, but Ed didn't flinch. He had expected them. He stood straighter, his voice calm, measured. "This isn't about Hawaii anymore. You stole from me. You humiliated me. And if you keep pushing, you'll lose more than Hawaii." For the first time, Brian's smirk faltered. He pushed the door wider, squaring his shoulders, his voice rising with forced bravado. "Lose more? You think you scare me? You're a washed-up old man with nothing left. You think anyone will believe you? Everything I've built, everything people see, it's mine. You can't touch it." Ed's gaze didn't waver. "I don't need to scare you. I just need the truth to do its work. And the truth has a way of spreading." Brian stepped closer, invading the doorway. His presence meant to intimidate. "You come into my house, accuse me in front of my family? Don't push me, Dad. I swear, you won't like what happens." Behind him, Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, a glass of wine in her hand. She leaned casually against the railing, but her eyes narrowed when they fell on Ed. She had always enjoyed seeing him diminished, but tonight there was something different in his stare, something she couldn't laugh off. It wasn't desperation anymore. It was fire. Her smirk faded as she whispered almost under her breath, "Brian, maybe don't." But Brian was too far gone. He jabbed a finger toward his father's chest. "You don't get to threaten me. You don't get to show up here and pretend you're some kind of victim. You gave me that money. You said it was for us. Now you're just bitter because nobody wants you around." Ed didn't move, didn't even blink. He let the silence stretch until Brian's words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and toxic. Then slowly, he leaned closer, his voice a low growl that carried more weight than shouting ever could. This was your last chance to make it right. The air in the foyer thickened, the tension pulling Lily upright, her hand tightening around the wine glass. For the first time, she looked unsettled. She saw it in Ed's eyes, that unshakable calm that only comes when a man has nothing left to lose. Brian, rattled but unwilling to show it, shoved the door violently. "Get out of my house," he shouted. "Don't ever come back." The door slammed shut, rattling the frame, leaving Ed alone on the porch with the echo of his son's fury. He stood still for a moment, the cold wind cutting across his face, then turned slowly and descended the steps. His cane tapped steadily against the concrete, each strike like a drum beat. When he reached the sidewalk, he paused. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shake his fist. He simply whispered into the evening air, his words meant for no one but himself, and perhaps the shadows that clung to the house behind him. "This was your last warning." Then he walked away, the weight of the vow settling into his bones. Anna sat at Ed's kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of tea she hadn't touched. She had been watching him for nearly an hour as he moved between stacks of papers, notes, and folders with the precision of a man possessed. His movements were steady, focused, but his face told another story. Dark circles under his eyes, skin pale, jaw clenched with relentless determination. Finally, she couldn't hold back anymore. "Ed," she said, her voice trembling, "you have to stop this." He didn't even look up, continuing to shuffle documents into neat piles. "Stop what?" "This obsession," she said, her tone breaking. "The late nights, the constant digging, the anger that never leaves you. It's eating you alive. Your heart can't take this stress. And if the law catches you meddling in things you shouldn't, if Brian presses charges, you could end up in prison." That last word finally made him pause. He lifted his gaze slowly, his eyes tired, but burning with something immovable. "You think I'm afraid of prison? You think I'm afraid of dying?" His voice was low, steady. "I'm afraid of leaving this world humiliated. I'm afraid of letting my name mean nothing." Anna's eyes filled with tears. "It's not worth it, Ed. You've already lost so much. Don't lose yourself too." But Ed shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It's not about money anymore. It never was. He killed the father I was, Anna, the man who trusted, who believed his son could be better. That man is gone." The words hung heavy in the room, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Anna's hand trembled as she set her mug down. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Then you've already lost him." The silence after her words was suffocating. Ed finally pushed his chair back, rising slowly, his cane steadying him as he stood. He looked at his sister with eyes that had lost any trace of softness. "No," he said firmly, "I'm not lost. I'm taking back my name." Anna covered her mouth with her hand, as though trying to hold back the grief spilling out of her. She wanted to argue, to shake him, to remind him of the gentle man he used to be. But she could see it in his posture, in the steel of his voice. Her brother was gone, and in his place stood someone who had chosen a path that could not be undone. Ed returned to the table, stacking his folders carefully, tucking them into a locked box he kept by the door. Every movement was methodical, rehearsed, as if he had been planning not just revenge, but the armor he would wear while carrying it out. Anna stood finally, tears streaking her cheeks. "If you go down this road, Ed, I don't know if I can follow you." He didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. The paper snapped shut, the lock clicked into place, and the sound carried more finality than any words could. As Anna left, pausing at the doorway to look at her brother one last time, she saw the truth she had feared. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was resolved. His obsession wasn't temporary grief. It was permanent, carved into him as surely as the lines on his face. When the door closed behind her, Ed sat back down, pulling his journal closer. He wrote slowly, each letter deliberate, each word etched with iron will. This ends only one way, my way. The path was no longer in question. Revenge was no longer an idea. It was sealed. The decision came with the weight of a hammer striking steel. Ed sat in Henderson's office, the dim glow of the desk lamp reflecting off a thick stack of paperwork. His lawyer flipped through the documents, his tone measured but firm. "Mr. Callahan, you have grounds, strong grounds. If you're ready, we'll file the civil suit." Ed's hands rested on the polished wood desk, his fingers curled into fists. He had hesitated for months, torn between blood and justice, but hesitation had burned away. "File it," he said. His voice carried no tremor. It was not grief anymore. It was steel. Within days, the paperwork was served. Brian was in his office when the courier arrived. He tore open the envelope, skimming the words: fraud, misappropriation of funds, civil complaint filed by Edward Callahan. His face flushed crimson. He slammed his fist against the desk so hard his coffee toppled, splattering papers. "He's suing me, my own father." His assistant froze in the doorway, too afraid to move. Brian's voice roared through the office, thick with rage. "He thinks he can drag my name through the mud. He thinks he can take me down." At home, the summons landed like a grenade. Lily snatched the papers from Brian's hand, her eyes scanning the accusations, her manicured fingers trembling. "Fraud? Misuse of funds? Oh my God, Brian, if this sticks, we lose everything. The house, the cars, your business." "Shut up," Brian barked, pacing the living room like a caged animal. His tan skin had paled, sweat glistening at his temple. "I'll crush him. Do you hear me? He wants a war. He's going to wish he never started this." But Lily wasn't convinced. For the first time, fear cracked through her polished exterior. She saw the truth beneath the anger, panic. The community found out almost instantly. Word spread from neighbors to churchgoers, from coffee shops to local papers. Father sues son. $20,000 Hawaii betrayal at the center of family feud. The whispers that had once been pity now swelled into full-blown gossip. Strangers who once nodded politely at Brian now glanced away, uncertain. Some whispered that Ed was brave, others that he was ruthless, but everyone agreed. It was shocking. Ed felt the shift as soon as he walked into the courthouse for the first hearing. The marble floors echoed under his careful steps, his cane tapping rhythmically. He wore his best suit, pressed and neat, the one Margaret had chosen for his retirement dinner. He walked past the curious eyes of townspeople who had come to watch, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel small. He felt taller than his years. When Brian entered the courtroom, flanked by lawyers in expensive suits, the contrast was stark. His face was tight with fury, his voice low but seething as he leaned toward Lily. He looked across the room at Ed, expecting to see shame, fragility, maybe even regret. Instead, he found his father's eyes steady, unwavering. The judge read the charges aloud: fraud, misappropriation, financial abuse. Each word rang out like a bell. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, reporters scribbling furiously, neighbors leaning in with wide eyes. Ed didn't flinch. He stood when called, his cane planted firmly, his voice strong as he confirmed his complaint. For the first time since the betrayal, he felt no humiliation. The shame had shifted, and it belonged entirely to the man across from him. Brian clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides. He had always been the one in control, the one with power. But here, under the sterile lights of the courtroom, with his father standing tall and resolute, the balance had shifted. When the hearing adjourned, Brian shoved his chair back violently, storming out with Lily trailing behind. Reporters swarmed him with questions. Is it true you misused funds? How do you respond to your father's accusations? His answers were curt, angry, defensive. Cameras captured every twitch of his jaw, every flash of rage in his eyes. Ed exited quietly, Anna at his side. He didn't answer questions, didn't need to. His silence was power enough. As they stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, Anna looked at him, her face lined with worry. "It's real now, Ed. The whole town knows. There's no turning back." Ed nodded, his eyes fixed on the courthouse doors behind them. "Good," he said softly. "This isn't just between us anymore. The war is public now." The morning after the first hearing, Ed awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. At first, he thought it was Anna, but when he finally put on his glasses and squinted at the screen, he saw the headline flashing across a news alert. "Father sues son over $20,000 Hawaii betrayal." The local paper had plastered his family's unraveling across its front page. There was a photo of Ed entering the courthouse, cane in hand, jaw set with grim determination. Beside it, a picture of Brian, caught mid-stride outside the courtroom, his expression sharp with fury, his lips caught mid-snarling word. Ed sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the images for a long time. Then, slowly, he exhaled. It's out now. There's no hiding it anymore. By noon, the entire town was talking. At the grocery store, whispers carried down the aisles. Can you believe it? His own son. In the church parking lot, heads leaned together. Didn't Ed pay for that trip? $20,000, gone just like that. At the barber shop, voices rose louder. That boy always thought he was better than the rest of us. Guess it caught up with him. The phrase Hawaii betrayal had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just a headline anymore. It was a phrase repeated, dissected, and passed around like a cautionary tale. Brian felt the shift almost immediately. Clients canceled appointments. Old friends stopped returning calls. His phone buzzed constantly with reporters asking for comments, each message sharper than the last. Mr. Callahan, did you knowingly misuse funds? Do you have anything to say about your father's accusations? At home, Lily collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her manicured hands. I can't take this, Brian. Everyone's laughing at us. Do you know what it feels like to walk into a boutique and hear people whispering behind your back? They're calling me a thief's wife. Her voice cracked, the tears spilling freely. We're humiliated, absolutely humiliated. But Brian's rage only deepened. He paced the living room like a storm barely contained by four walls. He's doing this to me, my own father. He's ruining my life because he couldn't handle being left behind. His voice grew louder, his fist slamming the counter. I built this, I earned this, and he's tearing it down out of spite. Spite? Lily snapped through her tears, lifting her head. He gave you the money, Brian. Everyone knows it. That's what makes this so ugly. He's the victim, and you're the villain. Brian turned on her, his face twisted in disbelief. You think he's innocent? You think he didn't know what he was doing? He's manipulating everyone, turning them against me. But the truth was undeniable, and for the first time, Brian felt it, the walls closing in. While his son raged and spiraled, Ed walked through his days with a quiet strength. At the coffee shop, people stopped him with firm handshakes. Good for you, Ed. Not many would have the courage to stand up like that. At church, where whispers once cut him down, voices now lifted him. We're with you. We've seen how he treats you. The pity that had once suffocated him was gone, replaced by respect. It didn't erase the wound, but it gave him something new, vindication. That evening, back in his study, Ed opened his journal. The lamplight flickered as he dipped his pen in ink, his handwriting steady despite the storm outside. This is justice, not revenge, he wrote. He wanted to erase me. Instead, he erased himself, and it's only beginning. He closed the book and placed it back in the drawer. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, the silence heavy. He knew Brian wasn't finished fighting, but neither was he. And as the headlines spread further, As neighbors gossiped and clients fled, Ed felt it for the first time. His son's empire wasn't invincible. It was cracking. The courthouse air grew heavier with every hearing. What began as a lawsuit between father and son had evolved into a public feud that gripped the entire town. Ed's complaint of fraud and misappropriation had painted Brian into a corner. But Brian wasn't the type to retreat quietly. Within weeks, his lawyers filed a countersuit. Defamation. The claim was bold, accusing Ed of maliciously attempting to destroy his son's business reputation through lies and exaggerations. Reporters pounced, publishing headlines that turned the feud into spectacle. Father accuses son of fraud. Son strikes back. The hearings intensified. Each session brought more reporters, more neighbors packing the gallery, more murmurs of divided loyalties. Some said Ed was brave, a father standing up against exploitation. Others whispered that dragging family matters into court was shameful, that Ed had gone too far. Ed walked into each session with steady composure, his cane tapping across the tile like a metronome. He didn't flinch under stares. He didn't falter when lawyers fired questions. To him, each word spoken in court was one step toward reclaiming what had been stolen. Brian, however, grew more frayed with each passing week. His suits remained sharp, his words smooth, but the cracks showed. He snapped at his lawyers, cursed under his breath, and shot venomous glares across the courtroom at Ed. Each time he tried to frame himself as the victim, the whispers in the gallery only grew louder. At home, Lily felt the weight more than anyone. The once polished socialite who relished in appearances now dreaded leaving the house. One evening, she sat in her car outside Ed's modest home, her hands trembling on the steering wheel before she finally forced herself to knock on his door. Ed answered cautiously, his eyes narrowing when he saw her. "What do you want?" She stepped inside without waiting, her perfume filling the room, her voice low and urgent. "Ed, please, end this. Drop the case. You've made your point. But Brian, he's unraveling. The children hear us fighting every night. We're drowning. Please." Ed stood still, his hands resting on the back of a chair. For a brief moment, he almost saw the young woman his son had once proudly introduced to the family. But the memory of the airport slammed back, vivid and merciless. Lily's smirk as he begged, her cold words, "We managed fine without the old man." His voice was quiet, but every syllable carried the weight of steel. "You laughed when I begged at that airport. You looked me in the eye while I was humiliated, and now you come here asking for mercy?" Lily's composure cracked. "I didn't know it would come to this," she whispered, her eyes wet. Ed shook his head slowly. "You knew enough. You sided with him, and now you can live with him." The rejection landed like a slap. Her face hardened, the vulnerability replaced by fury. Without another word, she stormed past him, slamming the door behind her so hard the frame rattled. Ed stood in the quiet that followed, the echo of her footsteps fading. For a moment, he felt the tremor of old grief, but then it passed. He returned to his files, his notes, his evidence. The war wasn't over. It was only intensifying. Across town, Brian's spiral deepened. Lily's anger, the children's unease, the whispers from neighbors, the glare of the media. It all pressed against him until his temper exploded. He lashed out at his staff, lost clients in droves, and drank late into the night, muttering about betrayal. Every headline, every courtroom appearance, every shift in the community's eyes carved deeper into his pride. He blamed his father for everything, convinced the old man was orchestrating his downfall with malicious glee. And in a way, he was right. Detective Alvarez arrived at Ed's house on a rainy evening, his trench coat damp, a manila folder tucked tightly under his arm. Ed welcomed him in, the kettle already whistling on the stove, but Alvarez didn't waste time with pleasantries. He placed the folder on the kitchen table and opened it, revealing a spread of documents stamped with state seals. "It's official. Alvarez said, his voice calm but weighted. "We have enough evidence. Your son's firm is under investigation for fraud. His business license will be reviewed for suspension." Ed's eyes fell to the pages. Client complaints filed with regulators, proof of hidden fees, emails where Brian overpromised returns and concealed losses. Every sheet was another nail hammered into his son's empire. For a long moment, Ed just stared, his chest tight. Then he exhaled slowly, almost trembling, not with fear, but with vindication. Across town, the impact was immediate. The morning the news broke, Brian stormed into his office to find two state auditors waiting in the lobby. They asked to see his books, his contracts, his records. His staff froze, unsure whether to continue answering phones or to gather their belongings. Within days, word spread to clients. They began calling, not to schedule meetings, but to demand withdrawals. Some arrived in person, faces red with anger, demanding answers Brian couldn't give. The polished facade of his office cracked under the weight of their voices. "Where's my money?" "You lied to us. I trusted you." One by one, accounts drained. One by one, clients walked out, slamming the glass doors behind them. At home, the collapse spilled into Brian's marriage. Lily cornered him in the kitchen, the glossy magazine life she once clung to unraveling before her eyes. "Do you understand what's happening? We're finished, Brian. The house, the cars, the vacations, it's all slipping away because you couldn't keep your greed in check." Brian snapped, pounding his fist against the counter. "This isn't my fault. He did this. My father. He's poisoning everything." But Lily wasn't swayed. Her eyes were sharp with anger and fear. "Don't you dare put this on him. You built this mess yourself. And if you think I'm going to sink with you, you're wrong. Maybe it's time I think about divorce." The word cut deeper than any accusation. Divorce. She had said it before, flippantly, but this time it was heavy with intent. Brian saw it in her face. Her patience was gone. Desperate, Brian turned to the one weapon he still thought he had, the media. He called reporters, gave interviews, tried to twist the story. He painted himself as the victim of a vindictive old man. "My father has always resented my success," he told one local channel. "This lawsuit, these accusations, they're nothing but an attempt to ruin me because he can't accept that I've built a life without him." But the public wasn't buying it. The town had seen Ed, stooped, steady, unshaken in court. They had heard the whispers of clients who had lost money, seen the auditors combing through Brian's office. Sympathy, once Brian's greatest weapon, had shifted entirely to the man he had abandoned at the airport. And as Brian sat in his empty office one evening, the blinds half closed, his phone buzzing with messages from angry clients and distant lawyers, the realization sank in like ice water. The tables had turned. The empire he had built on arrogance and deceit was crumbling. And the man he had written off as powerless, his father, was the one holding the match. It was near midnight when the pounding on Ed's front door began. Heavy, furious blows that rattled the frame and echoed through the quiet house. Ed rose slowly from his armchair, cane in hand, his body weary but his mind steady. He already knew who it was. When he opened the door, Brian stood on the porch, face flushed, sweat glistening at his temples despite the cool night. His eyes were wild, unfocused, and his voice erupted the moment he saw his father. "You're killing me!" Brian shouted, his fist shaking at his sides. "Do you even understand what you've done? My business is gone. My clients are gone. Lily's threatening to leave me." His voice cracked with rage, each word hurled like a stone. Ed leaned against the door frame, unshaken. His voice was calm, almost quiet in comparison. "I didn't take anything from you, Brian. I'm just showing the truth. You did the rest yourself." The calmness infuriated Brian. He stormed past his father into the living room, his movements violent, restless. He kicked the edge of the rug, sending the corner curling up, then grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it against the wall. The crash filled the house, shards scattering across the floor. But Ed didn't flinch. He remained by the doorway, his eyes steady, his voice unwavering. Breaking things won't change what you've done. Brian spun around, chest heaving, veins bulging at his neck. You think you're stronger than me now? You think you've won because you dragged me into court? You're nothing without me. Nothing. Ed stepped further into the room, cane tapping on the hardwood, each strike deliberate. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on his son. For the first time in their lives, the balance had shifted. Brian, the loud, brash, domineering son, looked small in the face of his father's quiet, immovable presence. I was nothing, Ed said softly. The day you left me at that airport, the day you laughed as security dragged me aside, but not anymore. Now everyone sees you for what you are, and you can't erase me anymore, Brian. Not ever again. The words hung in the air, heavier than the shattered glass on the floor. Brian's chest rose and fell with violent breaths, but his father's composure only made his fury collapse in on itself. He lunged forward, gripping the back of a chair as though he might throw it next. Before he could, flashing red and blue lights washed through the front windows. Tires screeched outside, and a sharp knock followed immediately at the door. Police! Open up! Brian froze, his wild energy breaking into panic. Two uniformed officers stepped into the house, their eyes darting from Ed's steady figure to Brian's clenched fists and the wreckage on the floor. What's going on here? One officer demanded. Ed gestured calmly to the broken lamp, his voice as steady as ever. My son lost his temper. He's not welcome here tonight. Brian tried to interject, his words tripping over themselves. He's lying. He's trying to destroy me. But the officer raised a hand. That's enough, sir. You need to step outside. Now. Brian's shoulders heaved, his eyes flicking between his father and the police. For the first time, he looked cornered, trapped by forces he couldn't charm or intimidate. He let go of the chair, his fists slowly unclenching as the officers guided him toward the door. On the porch, one officer lowered his voice but kept it firm. You set foot here again like this, you'll be spending the night in a cell. Do you understand? Brian nodded stiffly, though his eyes burned with rage. He cast one last look at his father. Hatred, desperation, and something else too. Fear. Then he turned, stomping down the steps into the night. Ed stood in the doorway long after the police car pulled away, the shattered lamp glinting on the floor behind him. His body ached, his heart pounded, but his spirit felt sharper than ever. The war had reached its fever pitch, and from here, there was no turning back. Ed's dining table no longer looked like a place for meals. It was a battlefield command post, covered in binders, receipts, highlighted documents, and legal briefs. Detective Alvarez sat across from him, his sleeves rolled up, a pen tucked behind his ear, as he flipped through the final packet of evidence. This is it, Alvarez said, his voice even but edged with gravity. Every thread connects. Hidden accounts, falsified contracts, client complaints, all tied back to him. Once this goes public, once the regulators move, there's no way out for Brian. Ed leaned forward, his hand steady on the table. He studied the papers not as a confused old man lost in legal jargon, but as a soldier examining maps before battle. And the timing? Alvarez nodded. Perfect. Tomorrow night is his investor gala. He'll be at his most confident, trying to show the world he's untouchable. That's when we move. Regulators, investigators, the press. They'll all be ready. He won't see it coming. The room fell into silence, the weight of the plan settling in. Ed exhaled slowly. Good. Tomorrow. He loses everything. From the kitchen doorway, Anna watched with folded arms. Her face was pale, lined with worry, but her eyes burned with both fear and admiration. Ed, you're 70 years old. Your blood pressure is through the roof. You can't keep carrying this weight without breaking. He turned toward her, his expression calm but fierce. This isn't weight, Anna. This is purpose. For months, I was a ghost, humiliated, erased. Now I have something to stand for. Her voice cracked as she stepped closer. But at what cost? You've already lost your son. Do you want to lose yourself too? Ed shook his head, his grip tightening on the cane by his chair. He took my dignity. He tried to bury me. If I walk away now, then he wins. And I can't let that happen. Not for me. Not for Margaret. Not for the name he tried to drag through the dirt. Anna lowered her gaze, fighting tears. She knew there was no changing him. All she could do now was stand beside him, even if it meant watching him walk into fire. Later that night, Ed sat alone in his study, the lamp casting a warm glow over the desk. His journal lay open, pages filled with weeks of notes and reflections. But tonight, he didn't write for himself. He drafted a speech, not long, not flowery, just words sharpened to a blade. He practiced aloud, his voice growing stronger with each recitation. "This is not revenge," he whispered into the empty room. "This is truth, and the truth will stand." When his voice faltered, when the tremor of age crept into his hands, he paused and looked at the framed photo of Margaret on the wall. Her smile seemed to steady him. "I'll finish this for us," he murmured. "Tomorrow we win." Sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake, the storm of anticipation pounding in his chest. Images of the airport humiliation returned, the flashing red light at the gate, Brian's cold words, Lily's smirk. But this time, they didn't crush him. They fueled him. Each memory was another drop of fuel poured onto the fire that carried him toward dawn. When the morning light finally broke, Ed rose slowly, dressed carefully in the same suit he had worn at the courthouse, and tightened the knot of his tie with deliberate precision. He stood before the mirror, studying himself. He didn't see the frailty others whispered about. He saw a man armored with purpose, a soldier prepared for battle. Anna arrived to drive him, her eyes searching his face for hesitation. There was none. She squeezed his hand tightly. "Just promise me, Ed. Promise me you'll come back from this." He gave her a small, weary smile. "I'll come back, but I won't come back the same." In the car, silence hung heavy. Both knew what was at stake. Both knew that by the end of the night, the Callahan name would never be the same again. As they pulled into the city, the tall hotel hosting Brian's gala loomed in the distance, its lights already glittering against the late afternoon sky. Inside, investors would be gathering, laughter and champagne masking the cracks forming beneath Brian's empire. Ed tightened his grip on his cane, his jaw set like stone. "Tonight," he said quietly, more to himself than to Anna, "the truth speaks." And with those words, the tension thickened. The air itself charged, as though the world was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, their golden light spilling over tables, dressed in white linen and crystal glasses. A string quartet played softly in the corner, as waiters moved with practiced grace, balancing trays of champagne flutes. It was Brian's stage, a carefully curated spectacle meant to reclaim the image slipping through his hands. Guests arrived in tailored suits and sequined gowns, their voices humming with polite anticipation. On each table lay glossy brochures boasting Brian Callahan LLC, a legacy of financial growth. For Brian, tonight was more than an investor gala. It was a declaration of survival. He stepped onto the stage, his smile polished, his tuxedo pressed to perfection. The microphone caught his voice as he spread his arms wide, exuding the confidence of a man who still believed charm could mask decay. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, "thank you for joining me tonight. I know there have been rumors, stories, but I stand here to assure you that this company, my company, is stronger than ever. We are poised for unprecedented growth, and together we will rise above the noise." Scattered applause filled the room, though some clapped more hesitantly than others. Ed stood near the back wall, his cane steady at his side, his presence unnoticed by most. He said nothing, his face unreadable, but his eyes never left his son. Brian launched into a speech peppered with promises, new partnerships, record returns, expanded offices overseas. His words flowed easily, crafted to soothe investors and silence doubters. But beneath the surface, tension coiled tight. Then, just as his voice hit its crescendo, "Together, we will prove the Callahan name stands unshaken." The ballroom doors burst open. The music screeched to a halt. A line of state regulators and uniformed officers entered, their expressions firm, their presence undeniable. One man stepped forward, holding up a document. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "We have a warrant to seize records and assets belonging to Brian Callahan, LLC. Step aside." Gasps erupted across the room. Guests turned in their chairs, eyes widening, hands flying to mouths. Some clutched champagne glasses so tightly the stems cracked. Others whispered furiously, "Is this real? Right here?" Brian's face blanched, his polished confidence shattering in an instant. "Wait! This is a mistake!" he shouted into the microphone, his voice trembling despite his attempt at control. "These are lies. This is slander." But the regulators moved with precision. Officers spread through the room, heading straight for the offices connected to the ballroom. They began collecting files, laptops, hard drives. Flashbulbs erupted as photographers, tipped off beforehand, captured every second. At the front table, Lily staggered to her feet, her complexion drained of color. She tried to steady herself, one hand pressed to her chest, but the room tilted around her. With a sharp gasp, she collapsed, fainting onto the polished floor. Guests scrambled to help, but all eyes snapped back to the stage as officers closed in on Brian. The warrant was read aloud, each word echoing like a verdict. Fraud, misrepresentation, misappropriation of client funds. The list rolled on, hammering at his carefully built empire. "No," Brian roared, his voice cracking. "This isn't happening. Do you know who I am?" Two officers stepped onto the stage, guiding him firmly by the arms. He resisted, thrashing against them, but the handcuffs clicked into place with an unforgiving snap. Cameras flashed, capturing the once confident businessman shackled in front of his investors, his reputation annihilated in real time. The room buzzed with disbelief, shame, and fury. Investors muttered angrily, some already walking out, tossing the glossy brochures into the trash. Others stared in stunned silence, the spectacle too surreal to process. And through it all, Ed remained at the back, silent, steady, his eyes fixed on his son. He didn't gloat, he didn't smile. He simply watched, the weight of years of betrayal collapsing into this single moment. As Brian was dragged past, his eyes caught his father's. Rage and desperation flared, but beneath them was something Brian had never shown before. Fear. Ed's lips parted just slightly, his words a whisper meant only for his son, though the force behind them was undeniable. "Now you know what exile feels like." Brian jerked against the officers, screaming something unintelligible, but his voice was drowned out by the storm of murmurs, cameras, and the shuffle of departing guests. Ed turned away, his cane tapping against the marble floor as he walked slowly out of the ballroom. Behind him, the glittering lights and champagne laughter had curdled into chaos. The empire was gone. The mask was shattered. But for Ed, the night wasn't an ending. It was the turning of a page, and what came next still hung heavy in the air. The morning after the gala, Brian's face was everywhere. The local paper ran the story above the fold. Investor gala ends in arrest. Brian Callahan charged with fraud. Television anchors replayed the footage on a loop. Brian in handcuffs, shouting as officers dragged him from the stage, his tuxedo disheveled, his confidence destroyed. For days, the community buzzed with the spectacle. At the diner, men lingered over coffee, shaking their heads. His own father brought him down. In church, whispers curled between pews. Ed was right all along. On social media, hashtags trended. Hawaii betrayal, Callahan collapse. Ed watched it all unfold from the quiet of his living room, the television flickering as reporters dissected every detail. Part of him felt triumph. His humiliation at the airport had been rewritten into vindication. But even as he sat straighter, a hollow ache lingered beneath the satisfaction. Lily moved quickly, filing for divorce within a week. The news broke almost as loudly as Brian's arrest. "I won't go down with him," she told a reporter, her face streaked with rehearsed tears. "I was blindsided, just like everyone else." But those who remembered her smirk at the airport weren't convinced. Anna sat with Ed one evening, her hands trembling around a tissue. Tears streaked her cheeks as she whispered, "It wasn't supposed to end like this, Ed. Family isn't supposed to be destroyed in courtrooms." Ed tried to comfort her, resting a hand on hers, but his own chest felt heavy. "He chose his path," he said quietly. "I only showed the truth." But Anna's grief was unshakable. "You showed the truth, yes, but we lost him forever." Her sobs filled the silence that followed, and Ed had no answer. Dr. Green visited a few days later, his manner professional, but edged with concern. He studied Ed's blood pressure, his breathing, the lines of exhaustion across his face. Then he sat across from him, his tone blunt. "This fight has taken years off your life, Ed. The stress, the sleepless nights. It's cost you more than you realize." Ed gave a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Years, months, weeks. What do they matter? At least I chose the ending." Dr. Green frowned, scribbling notes, but said no more. As the days stretched on, the victory began to taste different. Neighbors respected him now, yes. His name wasn't whispered with pity anymore, but with admiration, even awe. Yet, when the house grew quiet at night, when he sat alone with Margaret's photo staring down from the mantel, the silence felt heavier than before. He had won. The truth had prevailed. His son's empire was ash and dust. But in the wreckage, there was no reunion, no forgiveness, no rebuilding. Only the hollow knowledge that he had destroyed what little was left of his family to reclaim his name. Ed sat at his desk one evening, the television muted, the news crawling across the screen with updates on Brian's case. He opened his journal, the leather worn soft beneath his fingers, and stared at the blank page. His pen hovered but didn't move. What was left to write? Finally, he closed it, sliding it back into the drawer. The victory was real, but it was a hollow one, echoing inside him like footsteps in an empty hall. The letter came on cheap paper, folded into an envelope stamped with the county jail's insignia. Anna handed it to Ed with hesitation, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's from Brian," she whispered. Ed stared at it for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was rushed, uneven. Brian's voice translated into shaky ink. "Dad, please, come see me. I need to talk to you." Days later, Ed sat in the visitation hall, separated from his son by thick glass. The room buzzed with other conversations, low voices, guards pacing, the occasional muffled sob. Ed picked up the black receiver, holding it calmly to his ear. Across from him, Brian did the same, though his hands trembled. For a moment, neither spoke. Brian's eyes darted, his once polished face now gaunt and hollow. Finally, his voice cracked through the line. "You ruined me." Ed's expression didn't shift. He simply looked at his son, his gaze steady, his silence heavier than any words. Brian pressed forward, desperation bleeding into his tone. "Do you understand what you've done? I've lost everything. The business, the house, Lily, the kids. I'm in here because of you." Ed's reply came slow, measured, each word sharpened by months of betrayal. "No, Brian, you're in here because of you. You didn't just ruin yourself, you ruined us. All of us. Brian's face twisted, his hand tightening around the receiver. Tears welled in his eyes, his voice rising into a near shout. I was your son. You were supposed to protect me, not destroy me. Ed's grip on the phone never wavered. His tone stayed cold, resolute. I was supposed to protect this family, and I failed the day I let you turn into this. You didn't just take my money. You took my dignity. You took every promise I made to your mother and burned it. The words cut through the glass, sharper than any blade. Brian shook his head violently, sobs breaking through the anger. No, that's not fair. You think you're some kind of hero. You're just a bitter old man who couldn't let go. Ed leaned forward, his face inches from the glass, his voice low but deadly clear. No, Brian. I let go the day you left me standing at that gate, begging like a fool while you laughed. That was the day you stopped being my son. For a moment, Brian's composure shattered completely. He slammed the receiver against the glass, the thud reverberating through the room. His sobs turned into a roar as he shouted without the phone, his voice muffled but feral. Guards rushed in, grabbing his arms as he resisted, thrashing in his chair. The receiver dangled from its cord as the guards hauled him to his feet. Brian twisted back toward the glass, his face red, tears streaking down his cheeks. He slammed his fist once against the wall, shouting words Ed couldn't hear before he was dragged down the corridor. The room returned to its dull hum, the chaos swallowed into silence. Ed sat still, the receiver still pressed to his ear, though the line was dead. His face was stone, his body unmoved. Slowly, he replaced the phone onto its cradle, stood, and leaned on his cane. As he walked out of the visitation hall, his steps were steady, deliberate. The guards nodded politely, the other visitors watched quietly, but Ed's eyes stayed forward. He didn't look back once. Outside, the air was cool, the sky overcast. For a long moment, he stood on the steps of the jail, breathing deeply, his chest heavy with something he couldn't name, not victory, not grief, something colder. Then he turned, walking toward his car without hesitation. The house was too quiet, not the peaceful quiet Ed used to savor with a book in hand or the radio humming in the background, but an empty quiet, one that pressed against his chest like weight. He closed the door behind him, the echo traveling through rooms that felt larger than they had ever been. His cane tapped softly against the hardwood floor as he moved toward the mantel. Margaret's photograph sat there, framed in polished oak, her smile forever frozen in the warmth of better days. Tonight, though, her eyes seemed sharper, almost accusing. Ed stood before the picture for a long moment, his throat tightening. I kept my promise, he whispered. His voice cracked, but the words were steady. I didn't let him erase me. I fought back. The admission hung in the air, heavy and unsatisfying. His shoulders sagged, the hollowness inside him deeper than any victory could fill. He had destroyed his son, dismantled every piece of the empire Brian had built on deceit. But as he stared into his wife's eyes, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like judgment. He turned away, lowering himself into his old armchair. The springs creaked under his weight, the same sound that had once comforted him during nights spent watching television with Margaret. Now it only amplified the silence. The emptiness gnawed at him. Each tick of the clock seemed to echo the question he refused to face. Was this worth it? He tried to shove it down, to remind himself of the humiliation at the airport, of the laughter, of the betrayal that had cut deeper than money. But no matter how many times he replayed it, the silence that followed his son's downfall rang louder. The door creaked open later that evening, and Anna stepped inside, carrying a casserole dish wrapped in foil. She set it down on the counter and looked at her brother, her expression filled with both love and sorrow. You won, she said softly. But what's left, Ed? He didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the darkened window. Anna's voice broke as she stepped closer. I look at you, and I see a man who fought harder than anyone thought possible. But I also see a man sitting in a house that feels like a tomb. You gave everything to bring him down, and now there's nothing left to build on." Still, Ed remained silent. He clenched the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white, refusing to let her words break through. Anna lingered for a long moment, then turned and quietly left, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The house returned to its suffocating stillness. Ed sat there alone, his breathing heavy, his heart pounding against the silence. The shadows stretched long across the walls, the darkness lingering not just in the room, but in him. The night pressed heavy against the windows, but Ed's mind drifted far from the Midwest. In his dreams, the air was warm, fragrant with salt and hibiscus. He stood on the sands of Hawaii, waves lapping gently at his feet, the horizon painted with streaks of orange and crimson as the sun melted into the ocean. And beside him, Margaret. Her hand slipped into his, soft and familiar, her laugh carried on the breeze. She looked at him with the same gentle eyes that had steadied him through decades of hardship. "We made it, Ed," she whispered. "You brought us here." He turned to her, tears sliding down his cheeks, even in the dream. "I tried, Maggie. I really tried." The waves grew louder, the colors bled into darkness, and he woke with a start. His chest heaved, his nightshirt damp with sweat. Pain throbbed in his ribs as he clutched at his chest, gasping for breath. Tears blurred his vision as the dream dissolved, leaving only the silence of his bedroom. It wasn't the revenge that tormented him. It was the loss, not of money, not even of reputation, but of family. He had avenged his dignity, but in the process, the last threads that tied him to his son had been cut forever. By morning, Anna found him slumped at the table, his eyes hollow, his hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. She touched his shoulder gently. "You dreamed of her again, didn't you?" Ed nodded slowly, unable to form words. Anna sat across from him, her face etched with grief. "Ed, you have to find peace. You can't carry this forever. Forgive him before it's too late." Her words pierced, but he shook his head. "Forgive him? After what he did? After the way he laughed? The way he left me standing there like garbage?" His voice cracked, his fist trembling against the table. "He didn't just take the trip, Anna. He took her. He took the last promise I had with her." Anna's eyes glistened. "If you don't forgive him, you'll never forgive yourself." And then what was it all for? That night, Ed sat at his desk, a blank sheet of paper before him. His hand trembled as he lifted the pen, words spilling slowly onto the page. He wrote of betrayal, of pain, but also of the love that once existed between father and son. He wrote what he could never say aloud. That part of him wished things could have been different. When the letter was finished, he stared at it for a long time, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. For a moment, his hand hovered toward the envelope, ready to seal it. Then, with a sudden spark of anger, or perhaps fear, he struck a match. The flame licked the paper's edge, curling it black, consuming each word until nothing remained but ash. He sat in the glow of the dying flame, the smoke curling toward the ceiling, the smell sharp in the air. The room grew darker as the fire winked out, leaving him alone with nothing but shadows. Peace had slipped through his fingers once again, and as he stared into the blackened remains of the letter, Ed knew the shadows would not leave him. They would linger, pressing against him in the quiet hours, reminders of what he had gained and what he had lost forever. The late afternoon light slanted through the blinds when Dr. Green came by, his stethoscope draped around his neck, his face a mixture of professional calm and personal concern. Ed sat in his armchair, the weight of weeks of restless nights etched into the lines of his face. Dr. Green placed his bag on the table, checking Ed's pulse and listening carefully to his chest. When he finished, he sat across from him, folding his hands together. "Ed," he said gently, You've been through a war, but wars leave scars. Your heart isn't young anymore. You need to start thinking not just about fighting, but about finishing. Ed gave a wry smile. Finishing. That sounds like dying. It sounds like living wisely, Dr. Green countered. Your body's telling you what your pride won't. You have to decide what comes next, not just for you, but for the name you'll leave behind. The words lingered after the doctor left. Legacy. A word Ed hadn't let himself think about in months. For so long, everything had been about tearing Brian down, reclaiming his dignity. But what came after? What did the Callahan name mean now? Scandal, betrayal, courtroom spectacle. That night, Ed opened his financial records again, but not to track his son. Instead, he looked at what remained of his savings. Not much compared to what he'd once had, but enough. Enough to mean something if placed in the right hands. He thought about Margaret, about her years spent volunteering at the local library, her love of education, her belief that knowledge was the truest inheritance. For the first time, the idea of giving the money away, towards scholarships, towards something that outlived both him and Brian, felt right. A way to rewrite what the Callahan name would mean. The next day, he shared the thought with Anna over tea. Her eyes softened, relief flickering through her grief. That's the first good thing you've said in months, Ed. This could heal more than just you. It could honor her. It could remind people who you really are. Ed stared into his cup, his reflection wavering in the dark liquid. And if I do that, do I erase him completely? Anna reached across the table, squeezing his hand. He erased himself. All you can do now is decide whether you want bitterness or redemption to be the last word on your life. The words cut deep. That evening, Ed sat at his desk with fresh paper and a new determination. He began drafting a will, each line deliberate. His handwriting trembled, but his purpose was steady. He outlined small gifts to Anna, to his grandchildren, but the bulk of his savings, what little remained after the wreckage, he earmarked for a foundation in Margaret's name, the Margaret Callahan Scholarship Fund. The words looked strange on the page, but also right, a way to stitch meaning into the wounds. Yet, as he signed the draft, his chest tightened. Redemption wasn't easy. Every act of giving felt weighed down by bitterness. He still heard Brian's laughter at the airport, still saw Lily's smirk, still felt the sting of humiliation. Forgiveness had never come, and perhaps never would. He leaned back, staring at the will. Would people remember him as a father who destroyed his son, or as a man who built something good out of ashes? Was it even possible to be both? In the silence of the room, the question hung heavy. Ed closed the folder, his jaw tight. He wasn't sure yet what his legacy would be, but he knew one thing. He wasn't ready to let bitterness be the only answer. The struggle remained, unresolved, as shadows crept along the walls. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled, the air tense with anticipation. Cameras clicked from the gallery, reporters jostling for position. At the front, Brian sat at the defendant's table, his once pristine suits replaced with the drab uniform of a man awaiting judgment. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed forward, but the anger beneath his composure pulsed like heat. Ed sat several rows back, Kane resting against his leg, Anna at his side. He didn't need to be close to feel the weight of the moment. Months of hearings, investigations, and humiliation had built to this day. The judge adjusted her glasses, her tone firm as she read the sentence. Brian Callahan, having been found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and financial misrepresentation, this court hereby sentences you to 10 years in state prison. The words struck the room like a hammer. Gasps rippled through the benches. Reporters scribbled furiously, microphones shoved forward as if to catch the echo. Brian's head snapped toward the back of the courtroom. His eyes locked on Ed, burning, venomous, filled with hate so sharp it could cut. He didn't cry, didn't plead. Instead, His lips curled into a snarl as he mouthed the words silently. "This is your fault." Ed met the glare with silence. His face was stone, his heart steady. He had expected rage, expected blame. But the weight of his son's hatred pressed deeper than he wanted to admit. The bailiff called for order as the gavel struck. The session ended, but the frenzy only began. Reporters swarmed the aisle, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward Ed. "Mr. Callahan, any comment on your son's sentencing? Do you feel vindicated? Do you regret pressing charges against your own family?" The questions came like gunfire, but Ed kept his head down, his pace slow but firm as he moved toward the doors. He said nothing. Silence was his shield. At his side, Anna slipped her hand into his. The warmth of her grip steadied him as the crowd pressed closer. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was the only comfort he wanted in that moment. They reached the heavy wooden doors, but before they could step through, Brian's voice erupted behind them. "You're dead to me," he screamed, his voice raw, echoing off the marble walls. The shackles on his wrists clinked as guards restrained him, but his words carried over the chaos, slicing through the noise until the whole room froze. Ed paused in the doorway. For a heartbeat, he closed his eyes. The words weren't new. Brian had spoken them before in anger, in pride, but now, with the weight of a sentence behind them, they sounded final. The echo lingered, heavy in the air, long after the guards dragged Brian away. Ed tightened his grip on Anna's hand and stepped forward without looking back. The cameras followed, the shouts of reporters chasing him down the courthouse steps. But his silence remained, as immovable as stone. The war was over. The verdict had been delivered. Yet the echo of his son's scream clung to him, refusing to fade. The night was quiet, broken only by the tick of the clock in Ed's living room. He sat in his armchair, staring at the muted glow of the television, though he wasn't really watching. His chest felt heavy, each breath shallow, but he told himself it was just fatigue. Months of courtrooms, reporters, and sleepless nights had worn him thin. When the pain struck, it came sudden and sharp, an iron grip clamping down on his chest. Ed gasped, the remote slipping from his hand as his vision blurred. His cane clattered to the floor as he struggled to rise, his body refusing to obey. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest, a strangled cry escaping his lips. The front door opened just then. Anna, carrying groceries, humming softly to herself. The bags tumbled from her arms as she saw him on the floor. "Ed!" she screamed, rushing to his side. She tried to lift him, but his body was too heavy, his skin clammy under her touch. Panic sharpened her voice as she grabbed the phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. Within minutes, paramedics swarmed the house, their voices clipped and urgent. They lifted him onto a stretcher, oxygen mask strapped to his face, wires trailing from machines that beeped frantically. Anna followed the ambulance in her car, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, tears streaking her cheeks as sirens wailed through the night. At the hospital, Dr. Green appeared, his face grim but steady. Hours passed in a blur, until finally he approached Anna in the waiting room, his expression solemn. "He had a heart attack," he said. "We stabilized him, but his heart is weak. One more episode could be final." When Ed woke, the sterile light of the hospital room pressed down on him. Anna sat at his bedside, her eyes red from crying, her hand gripping his. Dr. Green stood near the foot of the bed, clipboard in hand, his tone blunt. "You can't keep living under this kind of strain, Ed. Your body won't hold out. If you push it again, next time, you might not make it." Ed's voice was raspy, but his eyes were steady. "If so," he whispered, "I've had justice." Anna's face broke, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. She shook her head fiercely. "Justice? Maybe, but no peace, none at all." Ed turned his head slowly toward the window. The blinds were half open, letting in a thin slice of morning light. Outside, the world went on. Cars passing, people walking, life continuing as though nothing had changed. He stared at it in silence, his reflection faint in the glass. The cost of revenge pressed down on him heavier than the weight in his chest. He had won, yes. But as the machines beeped softly around him, as his sister's sobs filled the sterile air, Ed couldn't escape the truth. Winning had nearly killed him. And still, the shadows lingered. The leaves had begun to turn by the time Ed returned to the prison. Months had passed since his heart attack, months of slow recovery, of quiet nights staring at the ceiling, of wondering what remained undone. The world outside had moved forward, but inside him, the war still lingered. When the guard led him through the corridors, the sterile smell of bleach and metal filled his lungs. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering against gray concrete walls. Ed's cane tapped steadily on the floor, each step deliberate, the sound echoing in the narrow hall. The visitation room was nearly empty. A few prisoners sat across from loved ones, speaking into phones through the thick glass. And then Brian appeared, escorted by 2 guards. He was thinner now, his arrogance stripped away by months behind bars. His hair had grown shaggy, his skin pale, his eyes sunken. He shuffled to the chair, slumped into it, and lifted the receiver with trembling hands. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stared at his father, the man who had brought him low. Then, in a hoarse whisper, the words finally came. "I hate you, but I'm still your son." Ed's face remained unreadable. He lifted the phone to his ear, his hand steady despite the tremor in his body. He looked at Brian for a long time, searching for something. Remorse, recognition, a sliver of the boy he once carried in his arms. But all he saw was emptiness. His reply came quiet, but sharp as a blade. "Not anymore." Brian's lips parted as if to argue, to scream, but no words came. He slammed the receiver against the glass, the sound reverberating through the room. Guards rushed in, gripping his arms, pulling him back as he thrashed weakly against them. Ed didn't move. He replaced the receiver with calm precision, rose to his feet, and leaned on his cane. He didn't give his son a final look. He turned, walking toward the door, his steps echoing across the linoleum. Outside, the air was cool, the sky streaked with the first hints of dusk. Ed reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, revealing the image he had never changed, the Hawaiian sunset, glowing orange and gold, waves crashing against black volcanic rock. He stared at it for a long moment, the memory of Margaret's voice whispering in his mind, "We'll see it together one day." His throat tightened, but no tears came. The war was over. There would be no healing, no reunion, no peace, only final separation. Ed slipped the phone back into his pocket, squared his shoulders, and walked slowly toward the parking lot. The cane tapped rhythmically against the pavement, steady, resolute. Behind him, the prison loomed, gray and unyielding. Ahead, the sky blazed with the colors of a sunset he would never see in person, but one he carried with him, a reminder of promises broken and battles fought. For the first time in months, Ed felt something close to resolution, not forgiveness, not healing, but an ending. And for him, that was enough.